A series that once explored the stars to claim every bit of innovation it could, now finds itself drifting lost into space, being forgotten by its very home. There have been many video game series that have failed to maintain their significance in the modern day, but none of them has been as tragic to me personally as the Star Fox series. I'm not a betting man, but I would wager that you at least know who Fox McCloud is, and possibly Falco Lombardi, or Peppy Hare, or Slippy Toad. You may even see some of these characters as video game icons, and yet, how many Star Fox games have you actually picked up and played thoroughly? And how many of them did you actually enjoy playing thoroughly? Star Fox has such an interesting history because its first two titles launched with a huge bang, not just critical success, but even financial success. And now we're in a point in time where there hasn't been a new Star Fox game in 8 years. Some of you may already know why and might immediately point towards its latest installment, Star Fox Zero, and believe me, we'll get into Zero. But I think the decline in the series can be charted way back before Star Fox Zero. In fact, I think they have had a pretty rocky adventure since they've first taken off. By looking at every Star Fox game released, we can really see a gradient of where things started to go wrong and maybe recognize some patterns that have brought Star Fox to the current state that it is in. I hope you'll join me to figure out if Star Fox deserves the place it has found itself in, and if it deserves the fans that love it so much. Kicking things off, we have the original Star Fox released on the Super Nintendo with some pretty awesome 3D graphics for its time, even though it's a little less awesome today. I can imagine how exciting this 3D would have been, especially with the shots coming directly towards your face. But even playing today, I found myself physically dodging my head to avoid the bullets as if they're actually going to hit me, even though I know they're not. I mean, this is just really exciting music. I honestly forget that I'm looking at pretty simplistic worlds with only varying sizes of rectangles for buildings because the music just takes me into another dimension, into another galaxy, if you will. I think what's also exciting is just how well the R-Wing controls, even with today's gaming hindsights. The way you can flip your ship vertically so that you can fit through narrower exits just makes you feel like an expert pilot, and transitioning the flip into a barrel roll feels incredibly natural. Despite depth perception making things generally harder in this game, shooting is surprisingly pretty responsive. Although dodging, that's where things get a little bit more tricky. It can be pretty tough to tell how close an enemy shot is, or even if it is an enemy shot. In this game, you can also switch between first-person and third-person perspective, and sometimes the game will even switch it for you at the beginning of a level. My word of advice, if the game switches you to a certain perspective, just stick with it because it's likely doing it for processing reasons. Sometimes you'll switch out of first-person in a world you shouldn't, and the game will generally slow down around you. I don't want to say the game is processing things poorly, but let's just say it runs fast until it doesn't. A Star Fox staple that this game introduced is having a campaign that you can take multiple routes through. It will take you on the easy path, medium path, or hard path. It's just a great way to have a short campaign that also has replayable value. There's even some secret levels that you can access, at least that's what I hear. I haven't accessed them because apparently that's above my pay grade. Too secretive for me. I can see new players having trouble getting into the game because the bar for entry is pretty difficult, but I promise you that this game is worth dying many times for so that you can get the hang of it, and you will get the hang of it, and it will be worth it because it's a very gratifying experience and ultimately a pretty solid first installment of the Star Fox series. For each of these entries, I'm going to be talking about their sales units purely so we can understand how it was received by fans, not as a metric of whether or not this is a critically good game or anything like that. Get that nonsense out of here. According to VGCharts.com, this game has sold just under 3 million copies, which is a pretty dang good number for the Star Fox series. The next game we're talking about is Star Fox 2, released in 2017. 2017? You may be confused, you may not be, but Star Fox 2 never actually released until it did. There are plenty of other videos that can talk about the development of Star Fox 2, but the general gist is that the N64 was right around the corner, and so was another Star Fox game, and they felt, what's the point of releasing this one just a little bit earlier? But the game was basically done, and Nintendo held on to it until 2017 when they released it as an exclusive for the Super Nintendo Classic. Of course, the game would also later join the Nintendo Switch Super Nintendo library. And I guess the developers didn't even know it was getting released, so when they heard the news, they all went out and got drinks, and I just think that's incredibly wholesome. That's probably a big oversimplification, but hey, I'm just here to talk about if the games are fun. Star Fox 2, also released on the Super Nintendo kind of, is a pretty ambitious evolution of the original Star Fox game. This time around, it shows an overhead map of an ongoing ongoing assault from Andros, and there are plenty of enemies being sent over towards Corneria, and you have to tactically choose where you want your ship to attack first, and there's definitely some optimal reasons to go towards a planet or a base or a missile or a giant ship in the sky. All pretty exciting on paper, and for the most part, also exciting in execution. You can also choose from a selection of R-Wings that you want to fly as well as a backup R-Wing for when yours inevitably crashes. Each of these ships also have their own unique stats, albeit pretty small varying ones, as well as different pilots to control them, but to be honest, their influence is minimal. There's definitely a couple areas of this game where you can tell that maybe it wasn't fully finished. The big thing that comes to my mind is the fact that Andros is literally a cube, like his profile is just slapped on the 6 sides of a cube and you blow him up like that. But also general performance of the game is not as clean as it was on the original, which is unfortunate. A big reason for that is that this game has a heavy presence of all range mode. Instead of flying just straight to avoid obstacles and bullets, you are now traversing around a various space, sometimes not just flying, but also walking on the ground. These R-Wings can now turn into adorable walkers that you can use to infiltrate various bases and gives you just a general break of the R-Wing dogfighting gameplay. And I'll be honest, there's some times where you really welcome the walker and there's other times where that's the last thing you want to use. I think the all-range mode in general is already tough to process with the limitations of the Super Nintendo, but with the walker it's even more so because you're usually in more confined spaces, so you have to walk through hallways and circle around various rooms to fight the objects in the center. Disorientation is probably this game's biggest downfall, but honestly it's not the worst experience. And there's some replay value with the different difficulties as they also kind of act as pseudo-campaigns, maybe not as extreme as the original, but still a good amount of replay value can be found here. Just like last time, the bar for entry is pretty high, but it's honestly enjoyable once you actually get the hang of it. Had this game been released on the Nintendo 64 with better 3D capabilities, it honestly might have been an awesome time, although I'm not sure I would trade it with what we currently got on the N64, which we'll talk about right after we talk about the sales figures of this game. That's a joke. I can't talk about the sales figures of this. You kidding me? With its release cycle? I don't know. Next up is Star Fox 64, which is definitely the most popular game in the franchise, as well as the one that has aged most like fine wine. And maybe I'm a little bold in saying this, but I honestly think this is the best aged game on the entire Nintendo 64 system. Everything, and I mean everything, that made the original Star Fox great is now done here, but in an environment that actually suits it. Even today, flying feels incredible in this game. Swerving and dodging out of the way of enemy attacks and oncoming asteroids has never felt so good, and they crank up the charm to 100 with incredibly cheesy voice acting, music that goes even harder than the original, and general feeling of wonder and discovery that was so common with 90s to 80s space-style media. To this day, I still don't know what this soundbite says.
Good luck.
You just hear it and you're excited. This game also introduced the wonderful charge shot, something that can lock on but also takes time away from shooting other enemies, thus potentially diminishing your actual score if that's something you care about. And after the first couple playthroughs of the game, you start to care a little bit more about that score. And I say a couple playthroughs because this game's actually pretty quick to play through, just like its predecessor. Branching paths are back, but now with planets in 3D that are actually worth flying through. Some of the paths I know by heart, and some of them I'm still learning because I refuse to look up certain things about this game because I always want a sense of wonder every time I pick it up. But it's nice going through one level and then randomly deciding, you know what, I kind of want to go to Solar, so let me go through that path that'll take me to Solar, and then I get to experience the lava level. Also, there's a lava level. It's pretty dang cool. You're constantly taking damage. It's brutal. I previously brought up that the pilots now have voice acting, but they also generally help you in your mission. You don't want your pilots to die more so than ever before. Slippy kind of plays the annoying co-pilot. It might seem fun to just let him die when people are going after him, but you also don't want to lose boss health meters, which apparently only Slippy knows how to analyze. While the other pilots might not be as essential, you still want to keep them around for when you fight Starwolf, because the last thing you want is all of the Wolfen ships following just you. That gets pretty nasty. And of course, keeping them alive also allows you to branch paths at various points. While the Walker didn't return, we did get the Landmaster, and even though we only get to use it for a short period of time, I always have a blast on the mast. Of the land. There's also this Aqua submarine thing, which is not incredibly exciting, but honestly, even that is a fun change of pace. I guess that's just the thing with this game, right? Is every moment is fun. Every level is unique and exciting, and there aren't moments where I just don't want to play the game, and I don't know if I can say that about any other Star Fox entry. A criticism I had with this game as a kid is that there's no saving, which was a little bit difficult when I had to redo the first level over and over again. As an adult though, I don't really see that as an issue anymore. It's just such a small playthrough, and Corneria is like incredibly fun anyway. I could play that level over and over again and it would still be interesting. But I do think having at least a level select would be a good way to compensate for no save station. It would be nice to be able to practice certain levels before actually attempting them on the campaign. Maybe another game will do that later. We'll get to that. Just you wait. Here's something people don't talk about with this game. There's a multiplayer mode. That's it, bye. I merely jest. While the single player is the star of the show here, I don't think the multiplayer is really that bad. It's definitely a skeleton of what multiplayer games were expected to be in the N64 era, but it has just enough facilitation to be fun, maybe late into the night or with a couple of drinks. My friend Spotters and I have recently found enjoyment in playing the Time Trials mode, which doesn't even sound like a multiplayer mode, but it is, and honestly, it's the only way we can play the game now. In Time Trials, you're racing to see who can destroy the most enemies, but you can still destroy each other, and if you die completely, you lose all of your progress, and it creates an interesting dynamic of both trying to avoid shots from the opponents while also killing some of the PvE enemies. It's good stuff. The stage selection is pretty limited, and the unlockables are pretty embarrassing for a multiplayer experience, but honestly, you will have fun with this if you've got the right friends around. And if you don't, then you just play the single player, and it's a phenomenal time. And a lot of other people found this phenomenal too, because this game sold over 4 million copies in its lifetime, which will end up being the highest selling Star Fox game as of recording. Before we get to the next game, a quick word from our sponsor. I don't have a sponsor. I don't have one. What we actually need to talk about is a little game known as Super Smash Bros., released on the Nintendo 64 to feature yours truly, I mean not me, but Fox McCloud from Star Fox. This isn't a Smash Brothers video. I don't intend to stay here long, but Fox's inclusion in the Smash Brothers series ends up being rather influential for Star Fox in general. After all, any IP that's been brought under Smash Bros. Wings that early has kind of become a gaming icon, giving popularity to people like Ness, Captain Falcon, and of course, Fox McCloud. We're not going to pretend that Star Fox's legacy is all thanks to its inclusion in Smash Brothers, but as we get further down the list of installments, we're going to see that it was a big part of breathing air into the series. And while fans awaited a new Star Fox game, Fox would reprise his role in Super Smash Bros. Melee, thus furthering his popularity into iconhood. Okay, bye Smash. Next up is Star Fox Adventures, which was released on the GameCube and is also one of the weirdest Star Fox games, and we already talked about Star Fox 2. Let's get the elephant out of here. This game was not supposed to be a Star Fox game. In fact, this was supposed to be an original Rare IP called Dinosaur Planet. Something, not a historian. Other people will tell you the interesting development cycle of Star Fox Adventures, but it is important to know that this is a Star Fox coat of paint that wasn't even painted on the game. It was splashed. And it becomes quite clear as you're playing. For starters, this game is an adventure game, and honestly, I'm not incredibly quick to throw out any genre changes within a series. I think if a series has gone on long enough, they have every right to branch out here and there to try new things and see if there's avenues that are more than just what they're known for. So that brings us to the question, is Star Fox Adventures a good adventure game? Not really. It's not awful by any means, but it's far from fantastic. But I don't want to immediately trash it without talking about some of its silver linings that make it stand out above Star Fox and other elements. I'm not saying that Star Fox necessarily needs a fleshed out narrative, but this game has one, and it's not a bad fleshed out narrative. It has a couple holes here and there, but the premise itself I find very interesting. And I really like how narrative driven just the beginning of this game is. The fact that you start off as Crystal before her getting captured gives a lot more stakes when Fox first discovers that she even exists. The beginning also introduces us to General Scales, and honestly, he's a pretty cool villain. It's pretty nice that they don't just reuse Andros again. Oh, he's back? Oh, okay, so Andros is still here, okay. And the world building goes hand in hand with the narrative. A lot of times there's aspects of the world that give you just glimpses into the lore of what's happened long before you walked the planet. Pair both of those things with some nice music that plays in the background, and this game does have some really nice music. Why don't more people talk about the music of Star Fox Adventures? That's my question. It's got some bangers. But it is beautiful and whimsical and wondrous, and it fits nicely with the beautiful environments that you traverse through. The world of Dinosaur Planet is actually very imaginative, and it fits an adventure game. Does it fit a Star Fox game? I guess now it does if that's part of the source material. Another word for no. This game has what I like to call window shopping, where you see elements of other Star Fox games that you really enjoyed, but you can't fully latch onto it. Like, there are a couple of space flying segments in between traversing places, and those space flying elements actually feel pretty fun. They're bare bones, but they're fun. But it's such a small part of the game, and there's times where you just kind of miss the original style. Another bizarre element is the fact that they chose to not give Fox a blaster, and probably because they wanted to put more emphasis on the staff combat. But to be honest, he could have had a staff and a blaster. I think that actually would have been a pretty gnarly combination. I'm sure there's some reason about the game not originally having blasters, and they didn't want to add it after Star Fox was shoehorned in. I get it. That's fine. We'll move on. But the problem is that the staff combat is actually really not fun at all. In fact, it's probably the lowest point of the game. You just go up to enemies, automatically lock onto them, and keep pressing the A button until they're killed. Now, they will try to block here and there, and they have these 4 heart systems, but the 4 heart system doesn't make any sense. You whack them way more than 4 times, and they're still standing. Apparently, it's only the combo finisher that gets them to lose hearts or something like that. I don't know, it's nonsensical, and sometimes there'll be a ton of enemies who just wait for their turn to attack you, which is pretty hilarious. I don't know if this is because Nintendo had a patent on the Z-targeting mechanic, but boy would it be helpful to Z-target these flying bats that come after you, because they are the actual worst. They're placed as specific hazards for when you're trying to carry bombs that will explode if you drop them, and of course if you get hit, you will drop the bomb. Screw these guys, I hate them. The staff can unlock various abilities, but to be honest, they really don't evolve the combat as much as I would like them to. One thing that can help combat is the shooting little blasts of fire, which I would prefer to just do in a blaster anyway. I mean, if you're gonna blast things, why not let the blaster do it so you don't have to have General Pepper here come in and say, hey, don't blow up the planet, you're here to save it. And Fox is like, oh man. That's a word-for-word cutscene, by the way. It's not word-for-word. Basically, I don't think the staff is all that great, although it looks pretty cool when you do fight people with it. I like the maneuvers that Fox does, but it's just like, that's the combat in a series that used to have pretty dang awesome combat. The funnest thing about this game is definitely exploring the world. In fact, you can explore most of the world without any loading screens, which is a pretty cool marvel for the time. And throughout this world, you'll find various dinosaur or dinosaur-adjacent civilizations, and learning about them and the way they interact with each other, I think is actually a lot of fun. But there's a big annoyance with all of the characters, and that's that sometimes they have voice acting, and sometimes they don't. There's this giant stone golem they call the Warp Stone, who has a pretty intense Shrek-sounding voice, and then suddenly he will stop using his voice and just talk in text, and it's like, what happened? Did you not record enough lines?
Who dares bother the mighty Warp Stone?
Makes him feel a lot more puny than the mighty Warp Stone. I actually think it's more fun when people talk in the dinosaur language. It's a little bit less cheesy. Maybe that's the argument of sub versus dub. At least that's what I hear people saying, you know, when they talk about anime dubstep or something. I didn't watch the movie. But some of these new characters are actually really interesting. The first one that comes to my mind is the vendor, the guy who just always wants more scarabs and is always telling me, I don't have enough of them.
Put that down! You don't have enough scarabs!
His voice is just so intense, and I think it fits his personality perfectly. But even the characters we already know have a little bit more life breathed into them, and I think that's kind of awesome. Even though the Star Fox crew is not in the game much, they depict them with pretty cool personalities. Slippy has a laid-back mechanic vibe going on, while Peppy Hair just gets mad at him for playing the music like the old geezer that he is. And they're all flying this junky Star Fox ship as if they haven't had a job in quite a while, which actually plays nicely into the storyline later, but we'll talk about that when those games come. The only thing is that they did my boy Falco dirty. And by dirty, I mean he's gone. Oh shoot, never mind, he's back. But not for long enough though. Another elephant in the room is that this game is often labeled as a Zelda knockoff. Now, is it actually a Zelda knockoff? Yeah, it kind of is. But to be fair, I think it was just because Zelda was showing how to be an adventure game in that era, and they just took those notes maybe a little bit too much to heart. But there's also a sprinkling of classic rare collectathon style gameplay, except arguably done pretty poorly. In fact, there are pretty much no optional collectibles here. I think what's most gratifying about a collectible is its optional value, when you grab something on your own accord and got a optional reward because of it. This game doesn't really have that. And a lot of the collectibles could honestly have just been merged into various things. They pretty much all act as keys anyway, so I probably would rather have just a giant key ring. It would make it easier for my head to process. So the gameplay is kind of railroady, but there are some interesting puzzles as well as segments to break up the pace. I particularly like the snow speeding sections, although they are very far in between, which the same can actually be said about the R-Wing segment, segments, very fun, but far in between. So it is a weird installment that introduces some less than fun gameplay mechanics, but I do really appreciate the amount of character that they brought into this Star Fox universe, and some of that will be referenced later on. Unfortunately, not a ton of it, and I don't know if that's because Nintendo is like, yeah, rare bad. Rare Microsoft now, rare bad. I bumped the mic. I bumped the Microsoft rare bad. Also, I would just like to formally apologize to Tricky. I was very harsh to him as a kid, because you can make him splat blood when you whack him for some reason. I don't know why they let you do that. But as an adult, I actually really like Tricky's character. Call me crazy, but I like him. Star Fox Adventures didn't have a horrible showing. It sold almost 2 million copies, but the actual critical reception was definitely not very high. People were fresh off the peak of the series. They wanted to see more of Star Fox 64 and instead had a complete heel turn. But something like that is not necessarily the end for a whole series. Next up is Star Fox Assault, released on the Nintendo GameCube, this time with none other than Namco leading the developing reins. I guess Rare just wasn't cutting it. Now, Assault was a much more comfortable game released in the Star Fox series, and mostly because it returned to the stars, you know, the actual name of the game. We returned to familiarity in the very first level with on-rail dogfighting, as well as our entire Star Fox crew being with us this time around, with one added bonus, that being Crystal. When I was a kid, Crystal's inclusion felt like a very understandable progression, but looking at it now, I think it's kind of a spectacle that we even got her still in the Star Fox team today. Especially as you actually get through the game, you notice that a lot of what happened in Star Fox Adventures is barely referenced or even mentioned in this new installment. So Crystal joining the team is pretty cool, but it's also a little bit strange given her personality shift between two games, but honestly, it's okay. It's fine. We're here now. And I think they generally wanted to get away from the more cheesy approach they had with Star Fox Adventures, because even Fox himself kind of feels like a new person now. But what's really important is that Falco's back, and he's here from beginning to end, and he's just as Falco as always. This time around, we also have beautifully rendered space atmospheres, no pun intended, with a pretty sleek mechanic art style as well. The Great Fox itself now has these shiny panels on them, which is a big contrast from Star Fox Adventures. After their job of saving the dinosaur planet, Star Fox got a huge paycheck that they were able to really modernize their ship. And just like old times, the music is as blood pumping as ever, and it feels like we really returned to the Star Fox formula in a then modern light. That feeling does not completely persist as you progress in the game. They kept the on-foot combat, but this time around there's not just regular blasters, there are various weapons that you can find to aid your on-foot journey. Or should I say on-paw journey. Oh, to my credit, it's been this long and that's my first animal joke. I do think the combat is more engaging than what we found in Adventures. Having actual blasters to shoot things makes it feel much more snappy, and it even has an auto-lock feature which matches the fast-paced ground movement pretty well. But there's definitely some clunky console shooting mechanics that was very common with various 007 games and other first-person shooters that weren't like Halo that did it right. In other words, you use the A button to cycle weapons and you can only cycle in one direction, which gets incredibly annoying when you have, honestly, more than 2 weapons. There's also this side-rolling mechanic that feels like it gets more annoying than actually helpful, and the B button is entirely dedicated to using your shield power-up when you find it, and it's not even a very useful power-up, so it's like, you need a whole button for that? But even clunky aside, I didn't hate the on-ground segments. In fact, there's one segment I hated a lot more, and that was anytime I had to use the Landmaster. It's hard to illustrate exactly why the Landmaster doesn't feel too good in this game, but the best way I can describe it is that it controls like the on-rail Landmaster segments of Star Fox 64, except the game is no longer on rails, at least not for the Landmaster portions. So moving left and right and turning to face the right direction and rolling all just feels incredibly annoying. And I'm just glad you're only required to be in the Landmaster a few times, because otherwise I would get really annoyed. But something that's really cool about this game is they allow you to choose a lot of times between what mode you want to do. A lot of the levels will have an R-Wing and Landmaster just parked in the map for you to take and use whenever you want. And while there are some objectives that require either or, I think the mix of being able to fly and go on ground is done pretty dang well. What's not done super well are the maps themselves, at least the ones on ground level. A lot of times they're way too big to be exploring and clearing out all the enemies that are required in the time limit that you have. There's a lot of missions where you just have to destroy these various nests, but the bigger the maps get, the more of a slog it feels like to walk around and find them all. And the big reason the maps feel this way is because I think this was a multiplayer game first, single player kind of second. Or at the very least, they were trying to be resourceful with being able to repurpose any of the single player locations into multiplayer locations as well. Because each ground level really feels like a battle arena, but we'll get into the multiplayer a little bit later. I want to talk about the base flying, which feels mostly good, except a little bit dumbed down. For starters, the got rid of the ability to turn your R-Wing sideways, which was extremely helpful for tight maneuvers in the previous games. Even just turning around in this game feels a lot slower because we don't have that ability. Which, to be honest, I'm just really baffled why it's not here. I mean, that was in the original Star Fox and it worked great. I don't know why they wouldn't continue it. There's also the auto-lock function, which I think aided the ground experience, but in space it kind of defeats the purpose of charge shots in general. The ebb and flow of the charge shot is that you're... Okay, don't force ebb and flow. The risk and reward of a charge shot was being able to track something and deal a bunch of damage to it, but the time it takes to actually charge up, you're missing hit opportunities to just point and aim at it anyway. Now there's not much point in charge shooting because you can reach a similar damage per second just by spamming the button that you know will pretty much automatically hit. Also, similarly to Star Fox 2, there's a lot less on-rail dogfighting this time around, and I think that's just my preferred style of dogfighting. Most of the levels in this one are all range mode, unfortunately. And especially unfortunately, because you can't do tight horizontal turns like you can in the other ones. Well, excuse me. There's also this mode that only appears a couple times where you're on top of one of your other pilot's wings and you get to control a Gatling gun with unlimited ammo and you just shoot things while they fly. Honestly, that part's a blast. There's even one part where you hop on Wolf's R-Wing. Have we even talked about Star Wolf yet? Okay, looking back at the recording, we did talk about them a little bit, just not a ton, but hey, Star Wolf's pretty cool, right? While they were completely absent in Adventures, they are here in Assault, and I like a lot of the banter that they bring. I don't entirely understand why they decide to help you. That seems a little bit out of character, but hey, it's pretty cool that Fox and Wolf get a little buddy moment. Wolf flies the ship, you got the Gatling gun, and you're just like, aww. They're gonna kill each other later. And this might be a good point to talk about the characters themselves. I already mentioned that Fox and Crystal are a little bit different from their counterparts, and frankly, the whole team feels a little bit different from Star Fox Adventures. It's almost like the game didn't even happen. But it did happen, and they do reference it in specifically one level primarily, where they head back to the dinosaur planet, except this time, they don't call it the dinosaur planet, they call it Saria. But now Rare's not with Nintendo, so I don't know if there's some legal issues with even talking about Dinosaur Planet, but I think we're lucky to even have Saria, because it does pay a decent amount of respect to the original Dinosaur Planet. I especially like that you can find one of these staff upgrade rooms. That's a pretty neat nod if you ask me. And as a reward for beating the level in Saria, we get to see a character that I've personally grown to like, which is Tricky, except this time he's like an awkward teenager, which is kind of funny. While he's only there for one cutscene, he does have some playful banner, and it just makes me happy that they at least referenced it, because if there's one thing I actually liked about Adventures, it was the world, and the lore, and the fact that it wasn't completely shelved away is nice. Would have liked a little more references, but that's okay. What we had is still special. Overall, I do think the campaign is a lot of fun, but honestly, it just falls a little bit short, both in terms of content that you want to play and just amount of content that's there. It's a pretty short game, and it doesn't have the crutch of the replay value of branching paths like the previous Star Fox games did. So by the time you're done with it, you almost feel like it's a little bit of a proof of concept of here's what a modernized Star Fox could look like. Modern then, not now. I feel like that should be my catchphrase. And this proof of concept also carries over to the multiplayer, which again just feels like it's lacking a little bit. It is cool that we can check out all of these stages that we did in the campaign as battle arenas, and they make much more sense here than they did in the campaign, but it feels more like a foundation for a much bigger game that isn't Star Fox Assault, if that makes any sense. If not, allow me to explain. With 2 to 4 players, these maps are just simply too big, and I think they knew it was too big because using radar is essentially a requirement. And the auto-lock features definitely feel more annoying here than they did in the campaign, because no one wants to die to someone with horrible aim with auto-lock. Now, it is cool to have an arena multiplayer experience with various weapons that you can use, as well as hopping into a Landmaster or R-Wing whenever you please, but the mix of not being able to easily switch your weapons and the fact that the Landmaster is just hard to control, and honestly the R-Wing overpowers the ground units any day, it's just kind of an unbalanced experience all the way through, and it's hard to get even remotely invested. As a kid, I was so excited to pick this game up specifically for the multiplayer to play with my siblings, and after we finally had it, yeah, we played it a bit, but like, I don't know, Smash Brothers is right there, you know? Overall, I think Assault's split objective of having both a campaign and multiplayer has just left it being halfway there for both entries. It's really not bad, and I probably would prefer to play it over Adventures most of the time, but any day of the week, I'd rather play the Star Fox 64 campaign, and honestly, even the Star Fox 64 multiplayer. As bare bones as that is, I've had more fun with that than any of my time multiplayer in Star Fox Assault. This will be the last Star Fox game developed by Namco, but I hope they pick up another some point, because I think they were almost there in several areas, in another attempt, I think we would get something truly awesome. According to VGCharts.com, the game has sold just over 1 million copies, which is not terrible for the GameCube, but it definitely charts a downward trend in terms of sales. So if we put ourselves in Nintendo's shoes as we go on past Assault, we might think, okay, they really like Star Fox 64. We don't want to do that exactly the same again. So we're going to try turning Fox into a real playable character. Okay, they didn't like that so much. Let's kind of backtrack a bit and return to the original Star Fox style in a modern light, but let's also make it more multiplayer centric. Okay, they liked it, but you know, it's not super up their alley. So the question is, do we now make a Star Fox that is truly like Star Fox 64, like people have requested and like we have denied to do, or do we kind of double down on doing something weird again? Because why not? Guess which one they did. Next up is Star Fox Command on the Nintendo DS, and yes, it is another weird one, but maybe my hot take of the video, I think this is a great Star Fox game. Command takes inspiration from a game that at the time wasn't released yet, which of course was Star Fox 2, as it took many of its elements but put it into a much more released game, because this one was released. We return to real-time strategy with an overhead space map, except this time we're actually able to trace where our pilots go on the touchscreen, something that is incredibly nice. We're also able to Star Fox command other pilots again, and like last time, they all have their own abilities and little quirks that make them their own. There's even good visual distinction between the ships, as they all have a little bit of flair that's unique to their characters. And there are a lot of characters this time around. You don't get access to them immediately, but you get access to them as you progress through the game, because the usual branching pathways is not only done again. At the end of most levels, you'll have 2 to 3 choices of where you want to go next, but those choices aren't based on which planet you want to go, it's based on what decision you want Fox to make in the narrative, which I think is pretty fascinating. So similar to other narrative-driven games like visual novels, these decisions actually play a huge part in your experience of the game. They don't just alter character interactions, but even the very levels that you go on will be vastly different, and who you play with will be vastly different, and I think that's honestly wonderful. What allows for this vast decision-making is that the characters are much more like characters this time around. They have dialogues, they have motives, they have feelings and thoughts, and I think that's something that's really special, especially because what makes Star Fox stand out amongst other space shooters is the team of Star Fox itself. It has a bunch of characters that are incredibly interesting. Even when just hearing them on the intercom telling us to do certain instructions or press certain button inputs, we end up falling in love with these characters because they're just that charming, and being able to dive deeper into them, I think, is something that's a little bit overlooked when people think about the Star Fox games. Through this game, I learned so much more about Fox and Slippy and Falco and Peppy and even Amanda and Cat, Dash, Bill, Wolf, Leon, and Panther. And honestly, the dialogue isn't even that bad. It sounds like people in a tactical meeting amidst a war, deciding where to send out troops to fight this enemy. That enemy being the Angular Forces, which is again, not Andros. Isn't that nice? Oh, hi, Andros. Why does this guy always have to show up? The coolest part about the narrative of this game is that there are so many different endings to this game, and they all depend on which paths you decide to choose. The endings themselves are pretty simple, but they do come with 3 art panels and a description as to what happened to the characters. Some of the endings are good, some of them are bad, some of them make you feel a little bit sour. At least one of them references F-Zero, and I think that's pretty cool. I'm just saying, F-Zero Star Fox crossover? Both series done really dirty by Nintendo, it would make sense. They gotta have their own support group. I think the game purposefully leaves a dissatisfying ending to be the default one so that you immediately want to play it again and try to get a better ending afterwards. And I'm getting too excited about the narrative. We'll shove that away for a second. Let's talk about the actual gameplay. This time around, every battle is in all range mode, which is a little bit disappointing. I have been told this is due to a limitation of the Nintendo DS, so maybe it's understandable, I don't know. And each battle kind of works the same way. You're sent to kill the specific units on the map, and there's other optional units that you can kill for various upgrades, as well as just increasing your time bonus. And that time bonus is pretty helpful because you're actually running out of time while you're fighting the enemies. There's 3 types of things that you target on the overhead map, one being a group of various enemies, another being a base that will launch said enemies as well as missiles, and the final being missiles. Technically, the missile segments are on rails, but they're all the same, and you just fly through a couple rings while shooting the missile. Most of the time, it's a cakewalk. And having played Star Fox 2, I think something that's disappointing about the bases in this one is that you don't get to go inside of them like you did in Star Fox 2. In that game, the bases were also just more varied in general. In Command, they all look the same, and you do the same thing to destroy them. You spin in a circle while following the squares, and then boom, it's destroyed. it's really not that exciting. So if you were to guess that repetition is a downside of Command, you'd be correct. It's probably its fatal flaw. And I don't mean fatal because it makes it worse than a great game, but it would make a fan hesitant to pick it up after they've been burnt by Assault and Adventures. Another thing that I think might throw some people off initially is the fact that you have to use the touchscreen to actually fly your ship, but honestly, I think the touchscreen works pretty dang well for piloting. Having stylus sensitivity is more accurate than you'd expect, and being able to use a stylus to both do barrel rolls and speed up is just kind of nice. But of course, they got rid of the flipping ship horizontal again. The coolest mechanic gone. But in my personal experience, the repetition does stop me from playing it for prolonged periods of time, but it doesn't ultimately burn me out from my general overarching campaign. I tend to see it from beginning to end no matter what, and a big benefit of doing multiple campaigns is that you get to have different changes of scenery, even if the battles themselves start to feel a little similar, going to different planets and having different enemy layouts, different fog hazards, and I think that alone adds enough varying gameplay to make it worth sticking through multiple campaigns. And if that wasn't enough, having multiple pilots is really awesome. Being able to choose between sending Slippy towards enemies because he has more bombs, or Crystal because she has multi-lock, or Falco because he's got a long power meter. Those kind of decisions is what makes the game really fun. And as you get later in more difficult campaigns, those decisions become much more impactful because it is a tough game and you want to make the right decisions. It's also worth mentioning that this game not only had DS download play, but it also had online play as well. And while I can't easily experience the online play for now, I definitely played the download play a lot as a kid and had a decent amount of fun with it. Again, I still think I prefer the bare bones Star Fox 64 multiplayer. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe I'm insane. I could be insane, but also the multiplayer is pretty bare bones here too, so maybe that's why. I think this may be the first instance where Star Fox decided to be weird, and it was actually incredibly successful in terms of having a really good game. Not incredibly successful in terms of sales numbers, though. According to VGCharts.com, Star Fox Command has sold 0.5 million copies, which is rather low for the Star Fox series and really low for the Nintendo DS lineup as a whole. I mean, this was one of the most sold systems of all time. To have only 500,000 for such a big name like Star Fox, that's gotta send the wrong message to Nintendo. And I think that's a huge shame because it's actually a great game. But it definitely sounded some alarms because we wouldn't be seeing Star Fox again for a very long time. Star Fox would end up skipping the entire Wii console, which is a huge shame because we've seen a couple of other shooter games on the Wii that would have translated the Star Fox decently well, I think. An example people bring up often is Sin and Punishment Star's successor, which was an on-rail shooter that used Wii pointer controls extremely well. I think if we would have had that with Star Fox, we would have had another weird installment that actually felt pretty good. Nintendo has made it pretty clear that they don't want to do Star Fox 64 again. They do end up doing it again, but we'll talk about that later. They want to be innovative. They want to reach for the stars. They want to expand what they've already made. And if we had something on the Wii, another extremely well-selling console, and it controlled as good as other rail shooters on the Wii did, then I honestly think Star Fox might have been in a better position than it is today. But it is worth mentioning that both Fox and Falco would return from Melee to Smash Bros. Brawl, this time joined by a third Star Fox character, that being Wolf. And for each of their final smashes, they had Landmasters, which again just ties more Star Fox lore into the common conscious. But alas, there was no Star Fox entry on the Wii, and instead we had to wait for the Nintendo 3DS for Star Fox 64 3D. Wait, what? A Star Fox 64 remake? What's all the fuss about wanting to innovate and change and stuff? I'm not actually upset because Star Fox 64 3D is a pretty dang good remake of the original. While the visuals aren't necessarily on the same level that Assault was, it's definitely a much prettier game to look at this time around. There's also a pretty good implementation of the 3D feature. The R-Wings have these trails of exhaust that really pop into your face, and various beams feel like they're actually getting close to you, similar to how in the original Star Fox I felt like I needed to dodge my head back and forth. I'm essentially doing it again, but in 3D. For most 3DS games I would leave the slider off, but for this one I was pumping up that third dimension pretty much every time I played. And the game itself actually has two campaign modes, one being for 3DS with various kinks ironed out, and one being the N64 mode, which keeps all of the beautiful imperfections of N64 within the game, except visually, still upgraded, but I mean, that's understandable. This game also introduces saving, which as a kid, that's something I really appreciated. As an adult, I just start a new campaign every time I play anyway. But level select is definitely appreciated. The 3DS mode also introduced optional gyro controls, which I've always personally had trouble adjusting to a handheld device where I have to look at the screen while doing gyro controls. It starts to mess with my head a little bit, but it's not a poorly implemented function at all. Now, if you don't mind me putting on my graphic designer glasses for a second, I think the GUI is actually probably the best GUI that Star Fox has to offer here. Just every menu, every computer screen, every slick metal feel just gets that vibe right. They've also really upgraded the multiplayer mode this time around. It's the similar style of Star Fox 64, except with actual maps that go more than just a couple pyramids off the ground. And there's all sorts of different items that you can get as well as just modes to play, and I think that's pretty swell, except they got rid of my favorite mode from the 64 version, which is time trials. Always remembered, never forgotten. Honestly, I think this is just a great way to do a remake in general. You add various improvements that iron out the kinks, but you allow people to experience the old playstyle if they wish. And that's exactly what this game did. Can't complain, and neither did the people who purchased it. At least I hope they didn't, because according to VGCharts.com, this game returned to the 1 million units sold, which is pretty nice. Now, if we go back to the shoes of Nintendo and they're like, all right, we finally re-released Star Fox 64. People bought it and they liked it. The sales went up from last time. Screw it. Let's just do Star Fox 64 again. Sadly, it's really not that simple. There's a very important person to the Star Fox series that I haven't talked about yet. It's Shigeru Miyamoto, all right? He's important. One of the many intellectual properties that he was the man behind was Star Fox. One day, the late and great President Iwata called in Shigeru Miyamoto to give him a specific task of, hey, make a single-player game that utilizes this little Wii U system thing we got going on, all right? Thanks, Chief. And he patted him on the back. That's verbatim, word for word. It's not word for word. Mr. Miyamoto was up to the challenge and began directing the next Star Fox game to heavily utilize the Wii U gamepad as per Iwata's request. I feel like that context is important to understand when going into this game, because we're about to talk about a game you might have already heard about, and not for good reasons. Next up is Star Fox Zero, a game released on the Wii U, and also the game that quite literally killed Star Fox as we know it. Like, I don't even really want to talk about this game. It's kind of depressing. I mean, I'm gonna do it anyway, but let the record show I'm not happy about it. Star Fox Zero is the definition of a big swing and a big miss. The game did utilize the Wii U gamepad, and it utilized it way too much. But it was also the game that really showcased what was wrong with the Wii U in general. As much promise as Nintendo presented with the Wii U gamepad, in execution, it was tough to incorporate it into our normal gaming endeavors. It's simply not easy to look at two screens at once, and Star Fox Zero requires you to look at two screens at once, or at the very least, switch back and forth. Generally, the main screen is used for more cinematic flying, while the gamepad is used for more accurate shooting. However, if you want to look at the main screen for the cinematic flying, you then get nerfed by how accurate your shooting actually is. So I guess the main screen aids the people watching more than it actually aids the player, which is not a great sign for a single player game. Your first thought might be, well, Pat, why don't you just look at the gamepad screen so that you can take advantage of the more accurate shooting? Well, there are plenty, and I mean plenty, and I can't emphasize this enough, plenty of moments where you need to look at the main screen as well, like literally back and forth. I just can't describe how challenging it is to actually give this game a shot. It feels like the game is working against you at every step, like there's surely some kind of mysterious control scheme that you don't understand that is hidden for the masters, and yet it's not there, it just sucks. I did manage to do 2 campaign runs, and honestly I did that through just mostly looking at the main screen, because that was honestly easier than trying to switch back and forth. And it's honestly something that's not horrible when you get used to it, up until the point where the camera focuses on a boss. As soon as the camera target locks into place, I audibly sigh, because I'm genuinely not ready for the exhaustion I'm about to put on my eyes just from looking between screens. It's really hard to talk about this game without mentioning the switching screens part, but it's just such a detriment. It's an awful inclusion. If we were to put controls to the side, which is doing more justice than this game deserves, but if we were to put the controls to the side and just looked at everything else, this game's a pretty beautiful Star Fox game. The levels themselves are mostly well designed, with extremely exciting elements happening in front of you, behind you, to the side of you, and this game also does a great job at breaking up the levels by adding additional modes like we've seen before. Both the Landmaster and the Walkers return this time around. And weirdly enough, even with the controls back in the picture, I do think that the Walker feels probably better out of all the transformations. The transformation that definitely feels the worst is the Gyro Wing, because again, it's a much heavier gamepad inclusion when you use it. Not only is the Gyro Wing annoying to fly through space, but its main mechanic of dropping down a droid is also frustrating. It's just really slow and clunky, and the wire's not long enough, and oh my gosh, why isn't the wire long enough? Similar to the Landmaster in Assault, I think there are only 2 levels that actually require you to use the Gyro Wing, but the Gyro Wing in this game is much worse than the Landmaster is in Assault. This was presented as a Star Fox 64 reimagining, not remake, and I think that's actually a pretty accurate term for it. It doesn't feel like you're playing through Star Fox 64 again, and I think for the most part that is actually good. While many of the planets and their point A to point B objectives have been reused for this game, they still feel like completely different levels in the modern light. And there is some enjoyment to be had in the levels before you reach the boss fights. Honestly, the boss fights is really what kills the game. And of course the gyro wing, you can't forget about the gyro wing. At least I can't forget about it. That stuff keeps me up at night. I'm really struggling here because I think going into this discussion, I was hoping to shed more positive lights on Star Fox Zero to reveal some more of its redeeming qualities. But to be honest, the more I sit here and think about it and express myself, the more I'm just like, man, that game sucks. Like, it takes a lot for me to say a game sucks. This game sucks. It's so bad. Now, something a lot of people don't talk about is that this game actually had a co-op mode. And this isn't some split-screen co-op. You are two people controlling the same R-Wing. And I think that says a lot about how much they missed a mark with the control scheme here. The person on the gamepad can aim and shoot, while someone with a Wii Remote and nunchuck can actually fly the ship. And to be honest, I think this is actually maybe a better way to play the game. If you have to play Star Fox Zero, and thankfully you don't have to, I guess I'm just a sucker who decided to make a video on it. But if you have to play, I'd actually recommend playing it through the co-op mode. It makes it a little bit more bearable. And of course, the entire time you're playing, you just are still longing for the days where you could control an R-Wing with so much ease, which they've done several times already. The last horrendous thing I want to mention about this game is the final boss fight, which of course is Andros inside of a giant cylinder for some reason with various openings, and this guy is a cohesive nightmare to fight. Flying around the cylinder, you're stuck in this fixed view, but then you have to look at your gamepad for where the glowing entrances are into the cylinder so that you can fly in, get into Dino mode, and then fight Andros. And even when you're in the tube, you have to sometimes switch to your R-Wing to turn back into Dino mode on the other side. Eventually, he knocks you out, and giant laser beams start shooting out of the cylinder, and you somehow have to dodge these laser beams while looking at a fixed camera and controlling your R-Wing. It's not a side-scroller, mind you, it is 3D, so it's very easy to not understand the depth of how close you are to the cylinder, and you're supposed to process all of this and keep your health so that you can keep the boss fight going. It's awful. Screw that boss fight. The game is beautiful. It has interesting concepts and a bunch of other things that would be really fun to realize on something that actually plays fun. And because it doesn't play fun, the game's not fun. According to VGCharts.com, Star Fox Zero would be the least selling Star Fox game of all time at 0.4 million copies sold. If Nintendo wasn't already shaky enough at the idea of releasing Star Fox games, they have become shaky now. The funny thing about this game is that it wasn't only the death of Star Fox, but it was also kind of the death of Wii U, and it was also kind of the death of Miyamoto directing games. This was the last game that he'd be credited as the director of, unless you include Super Mario Run, released the same year. But it's safe to say he either reached for the stars too much here, or he reached for the wrong ones altogether.
When there's an arch, you want to go under it, right? That's the kind of game I wanted to make.
Now you might think that this is the last Star Fox game. You're right, but also wrong. Next up is Star Fox Guard, also released on the Wii U as a companion game to Star Fox Zero. As for why it was set up as a separate game, still no one knows. Technical reason, data on a disc or something like that. I bet that's the answer, but I don't care. We're talking about Guard. Star Fox Guard is a pack-in game for a reason. It is extremely basic and simply doesn't evolve. It's a game where you control multi-camera sentries to fight off enemies that are trying to steal ore or something from your plant. I don't know, I wasn't paying that much attention. I guess it's kind of neat that you can pinpoint exactly where you want cameras to go, and switching back and forth does give you a little bit of an intensity rush as you're trying to make sure nothing is escaping through any cameras. And there is a boss fight that you get to experience that I think might have been actually more fun than anything else in the game. But you won't be playing this game for long. The customizations themselves kind of become redundant, and it doesn't have very much replay value at all. I played for about an hour, I almost beat the boss, and I just simply didn't have the motivation to keep playing. I was like, I'm good. And with that, now you might be thinking, we're done with Star Fox games. But you're wrong, and also right. The last thing I want to talk about is a Ubisoft game called Starlink Battle for Atlas, which has some Star Fox inclusions on the Nintendo Switch version. Now, this isn't a Star Fox game, it's not even close, but you could make an argument that it has almost as much Star Fox representation as Star Fox Adventures, because there's a surprisingly decent amount of Star Fox representation in this game. Could have been more, but could have been less. Honestly, part of the reason I wanted to talk about this game is because it actually comes with a physical R-Wing, which is kind of neat. You essentially get to put it on top of your controller and have just a little bit of weight to your controller. You also have your little pilot that you can put inside of it. My first thought when seeing this R-Wing attached to the grip is that, oh, that's going to be pretty cool when you have gyro controls, because you can actually see the ship move real time with where it's being pointed in the game. However, this game doesn't have gyro controls, so I guess that's a huge missed opportunity. It just feels like I got a giant thing on my hands. The game itself seems fine. It's more of a space exploration game than it is a dogfighting game, but they do have these dogfighting elements, and I did have some fun. I also really like the Star Fox cutscenes they've added. There's not much of them, but it does show some more classic team banter that I'm just oh so fond of hearing. And I guess canonically this would take place before Star Fox Adventures because Crystal is nowhere to be seen, and I just hope they don't forget about her in the long run, but whatever, that's neither here nor there. It's also pretty neat that you can fly your R-Wing just above the ground at lightning speeds in this more open world game, and if you're done exploring the actual planet itself, you can just go straight into space and then boom, you're in space, a pretty seamless transition. In a lot of ways it reminds me of No Man's Sky, but having only played a little bit of both of those games, maybe that's not a fair comparison. I also was not invested in the story at all, I was just invested on how Fox would react to the various story elements. And what's really cool is that this R-Wing comes with an ability to summon other Star Fox pilots with you. So you can use it to get Slippy with you or Falco with you, and it also triggers some classic Star Fox music, which again brings that blood pumping. As for everything else Starlink related, I just didn't care, and I wasn't really looking out for that stuff. I mainly came here to talk about the Star Fox elements, and for the most part I'm like, yeah, it's fun enough. And now that's actually it for Star Fox games. It's also worth mentioning that Star Fox representation in Smash Bros. Has continued to be prominent and still one of the most prominent characters of the cast. I mean, when people talk about Smash Bros. Characters, the name Fox McCloud comes up pretty dang quickly. And the big part of that is him just being part of the competitive meta for several Smash installments. And we don't need to get into the sales figures of the Smash Bros. Games, but it's kind of bizarre that Star Fox has become far more popular for its representation in Smash than its own games, at least in Common Day. It just feels like the only thing still breathing life into the Star Fox name. That, and of course every time they re-release Star Fox 64 as a downloadable game. But it's just kind of depressing being a Star Fox fan. Looking back at each of the Star Fox titles, how many of them are actually considered good games, you know, and how much does being a good game actually matter to a Star Fox fan? I'm personally a huge Star Fox fan, and I look at the series with some sort of pride, despite so many of the games just falling short of greatness. I love the worlds, I love the characters, I love the music, I love the feeling that I have when I play these games, and yet I don't actually love most of the games. Earlier in this video I asked if Star Fox deserves its fans, but honestly something we also need to ask is, do the fans deserve Star Fox? I mean, they've made it pretty clear that they didn't want to retread the same ground as Star Fox 64, and every time they didn't retread the same ground, we kind of bashed them. We gave it poor reviews, we didn't buy it as much, and I mean, that's our consumer right. If we don't want to buy a game that we just don't think we'll like, then we're not going to buy it, and that's totally fine. I know the initial announcement of Star Fox Zero was, oh my gosh, another Star Fox 64 remake, they're clearly out of ideas and stuff, but to be honest, it really wasn't a Star Fox 64 remake. It was its own game. It just also sucked. But Command didn't suck, and that was definitely its own game. Assault didn't suck. Even Adventures didn't suck. But the message we give out is, no, just Star Fox 64. I think that's a little bit of an issue. I think we have inadvertently started to suffocate a series into becoming just one thing until it literally is just one thing, re-releases of Star Fox 64. I think the truth is that Star Fox doesn't deserve us, and we don't deserve Star Fox. When I say Star Fox died, I do think it died, but it won't be dead forever. Nostalgia is simply too much of a profitable margin for Nintendo to abandon one of its most beloved IPs. But I just can't imagine that Nintendo's gonna feel super inspired to make something creative and weird and have its own identity like so many of the other Star Fox games. Instead, they're probably just gonna do something rather by the books. Hopefully, I get to eat my words. I'll see you when the next Star Fox game is officially announced. I talked about a lot of old games today, but if you want to hear me talk about some more recent things, you can check out my video on modern LEGO games. You can also support me on Patreon to get access to all the footage you've seen in this video that you can use for your own creative projects. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the stars. Take care. So long.